Welcome to The Disappearing Mind, a unique podcast helping you find clarity and support along your dementia journey. Now, join National Dementia Trainer and Coach Dawn Platt for an all-new episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. So glad that you have joined me today. In the studio today, I have a friend and a daughter of someone who has dementia. I want you to welcome Melissa.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
Melissa, I'm excited to be doing this podcast. Father's Day is coming up, and I know that you have a heartwarming story, one that many people face, and I know that it's very personal to you. But I think that the objective of the podcast is and always will be is to tell real stories about real people. And there's no right or wrong, but I think sharing stories for people who are on the dementia journey, in your shoes, in my shoes, is very helpful. That's the feedback that I've got. I know that with Father's Day coming up, there's a lot to think about. And I think it's an emotional time for many, whether their fathers are living or not. But let's go ahead and get into this and kind of unpack it. Let's start by saying that Melissa's father was diagnosed not too long ago with dementia. We believe that dad is in the early mid stages of dementia, and we'll verify that as we go through our questions. But Melissa, can you describe your father's journey with dementia? Help us understand kind of a little bit about it, how it came about.
Yes, definitely. And thank you for having me on. As you said, it isn't a very emotional subject, but you as an expert and a friend has been wonderful to me through this journey. I'll start out by saying he's a retired NYPD police officer, someone I would say is not very emotional, has always been very strong. So it's been an adjustment. Some of the first signs, he actually has some hearing loss as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we would often think him not being as involved in conversations was due to the hearing loss. But the real wake-up call was on Halloween, not this past Halloween, I believe it was the year before. My mom had told him it was Halloween, and he said, "Oh, we don't have any candy. I need to go out and buy candy." And at that time, we had not been allowing him to drive already due to his hearing loss. His eyesight's not great. And knowing that he was having this memory loss, he had a few incidences of going to appointments where he actually got lost before that.
Yeah.
But then on this day on Halloween, my mom stepped into the other room. She came out. He was gone. And she realized, oh no, he must have went off to go buy candy like he mentioned. So my mom called me frantically. I happened to be working from home that day. And then he actually did call her. He had the sense to call her. Thankfully at that time, he kind of described where he was, and we figured out we're here in Naples at the Mercado shops. She told him just stay right there. I took the car down there in order to get him, and I drove him home. That was pretty much the real wake-up call. Okay, he definitely can't be driving. He can't be doing things on his own like this. I know he wanted to help and try to get candy for Halloween, but that didn't happen.
Wow. I guess I didn't realize that your father was an NYPD police officer. I don't know how I didn't know that, but I didn't know that. So that really puts a whole new spin on who he is as a person and kind of his journey because of that role that he had in his career and his life. So it really is going to change outcomes of how I would advise you in dealing with him and supporting him, because he had to be somebody in charge. He had to be the man's man of the house, the father, and all of those things. So tell us a little bit about how was he diagnosed? Was he officially diagnosed, and how did that come about?
Yes, he was just officially diagnosed this past November. It was a long journey to even get to a diagnosis. Lots of appointments with a neurologist, tests with a psychologist or psychiatrist, I believe. And just, I think a lot of it was my mom dragging her feet a little bit to get all these appointments done to get to that official diagnosis. So we went to the appointment. We knew already at that point, we really did. But the doctor told us, and then it just kind of felt like, okay, he has Alzheimer's in particular. Okay, he has Alzheimer's. There you go. Good luck.
Well, I remember you sharing that with me when it happened, and you were kind of dumbfounded. as any family member would be. But talk a little bit about that. It was like it was just dropped in your lap, like he had the common cold with no instruction for the future, no thought. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. The doctor just said it so matter of factly. He didn't offer any resources. I had to follow up asking him, okay, when should we come back for another appointment? When do we know when it's time for memory care? What stage is he in? All the questions. It was really just kind of, okay, yeah, it's a progressive disease. It's hard. There you go.
What did you feel like, or what did you do?
I felt helpless. Like I said, it wasn't a surprise to us, but it was still emotional,
Sure.
to get an official diagnosis.
Yeah.
And at that same time, my mom was having her own health issues. So there was a lot of guilt because a lot of the focus was on her and not as much on him, because we knew this wasn't a surprise to us. Okay, we need to take care of the pressing things happening with my mom.
Right. So tell us a little bit about your family dynamics. Like, what was your family like growing up? We know what your dad did. What did your mom do? And do you have brothers and sisters? And where do you fall in that lineup?
Yeah, so I am actually the youngest of 3 girls by a lot. I'm 13 and 15 years younger. So I was always the baby, and it's almost like they had another life before me.
Right.
He retired from NYPD when I was, I think, 6 or 7. So I was pretty young, and he moved on to doing other security type jobs and things like that. And we moved down here when I was 13. My sisters stayed in New York. So we kind of started a new life here. And he's the only man of the house.
Right.
So the unemotional one, the strong one, with all these girls in the house and estrogen in the house.
Yes, I imagine. So what was your relationship like with your father growing up?
Yeah, he's definitely not a touchy-feely, emotional, like I said, type of guy. But I think with me, the youngest, he softened up a lot.
You're the baby.
I'm the baby, and he had more time. We did a lot of traveling, the 3 of us, my mom, my dad. We, again, started a new life here, moved to Florida. So it just was maybe a little different dynamic, because when my sisters were younger, he was gone working a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even when they were very, very young, they had moved out from New York City to Long Island. And my mom talks about that time as being almost very lonely, because she just had a baby and a 2-year-old out there, and he was busy in the city working.
Right. Yeah. So did your mom work, or did she have a career maybe later in life, or?
Yeah, she did. She worked in schools, and then she ended up later in life actually having a career teaching English as a second language in New York, and then also down here once she moved here. So she found that passion for teaching later in life. And she also was a caregiver to my grandmother. She moved in with us when I was, again, right around that time, about 6.
Oh, really? Did your grandmother have dementia?
She didn't until the end.
Okay.
She wasn't officially diagnosed. I don't think she was, but later on, the signs were definitely there.
Yeah.
She lived till she was 90. She moved down with us to Florida. So my mom has had
years of caregiving.
She really has.
Absolutely. So how has your father's condition affected the family, and how do different family members, how are they coping with it?
Yeah, I would say my mom right now is in a stage of not fully understanding it or wanting to accept it and understanding it, where she'll ask him to get up and do this or help her with this, and he won't. And she'll feel annoyed.
Right.
And thinks that, oh, he knows more than what he's letting on. And it's frustrating to her. And I try to help educate her that, no, he's not trying to be difficult. It's just part of what's going on with him right now.
Yeah. And isn't that hard for spouses to recognize, especially if they've been married as long as your parents have? I mean, you may know that he has dementia or Alzheimer's, but it's really hard to associate that with the person you've been married to, that you've known so long. You had this relationship, this way in life and partnership. It is hard for families to recognize that he's just not being lax or lazy or anything. It's not intentional. And it's something that husbands and wives talk about. Well, he knows what he's doing or whatever, which is not the case. But it's hard to recognize that because it ebbs and flows. Daily life ebbs and flows. Well, What are some of the hardest challenges that you have had to face? And I know we discussed a recent scenario, which I want to talk about in depth because it's one of those things that it always comes to that. And it doesn't have to be dementia scenario with your parents or grandparents. It can happen as people age, decisions have to be made. But you and your sister had to make the decision, and your mother. Tell me about the decision that was made that your dad wasn't going to drive anymore and taking away the car keys. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. And as I said before, he even had that incident on Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
We were not really allowing him to drive. I don't know if it was even a real discussion about taking away the keys. It was kind of just my mom would not have them out for him.
Uh-huh.
And he just came to accept it. And I think it really scared him that day. He realized, okay, I can't go out and drive because I'll get lost.
Right. So how did he react though? I mean, obviously your dad was probably in charge in the household most of
Yes.
your life. How did he react to your mom or even you? Was he able to reason through that safety was a factor for him? The reason I ask is I do have a family that I coach that he was also a police officer.
Okay.
And so he's very by the rule, by the law. You wouldn't find him speeding or things like that. So the family used a lot of his background in convincing. But how did your dad initially react in telling that he couldn't drive anymore? I mean, that's a major step in anyone's life, but especially a man and especially a police officer.
It is.
So
I think it scared him enough for him to get to a location and not know where he was to realize he could not drive. So he actually accepted it pretty easy. He will bring up sometimes, oh, I can still drive, or I can take us there, but that's not been the biggest challenge, thankfully.
right. So I'm suspecting, and I remember the conversation with you, that it was probably harder for you than it was for him. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I would say we actually gave his car to my sister and her boyfriend kind of recently. And that was a harder discussion because for whatever reason, he got really emotional about it and said, "You're giving away my car. I need my car." So in his mind, he thought he was still driving.
Right.
I think that's why it hasn't been as hard for him because he still thinks, oh, I can drive.
Sure.
But he got very emotional. He cried. He's not someone that I've seen cry maybe a couple times in my life. One of them being when he left me for college and when I got married. Those are probably the only 2 times I had remembered seeing him cry.
Right.
So to cry over the car, he said, "I'm very attached to that car." So it was just heartbreaking.
Well,
It's just an object.
yeah. And it's an object, but to him, it's a very important one. I'm sure that he probably took a lot of pride in it and those sorts of things. And so I think we had a conversation about this where we really have to broach that conversation very gently, because what you and I may not feel like is really that important could be very important to the person, our loved one who has dementia. So we can't really scale the value of objects and things until we do the survey, because certain things, they will just attach emotional value to them, sentimental value to them for whatever reason. And so we have to very gently broach these conversations, and we could offend them. Like by devaluing something, well, I don't know what the big deal is, Dad, right? That they really place a lot of value in it. And I guess you have to think about it from this perspective. Driving is part of our lives. It is our vehicles. Like we decide it's our car, it gets us places. And although we may not think so much about it, if we were told, you and I, that we couldn't drive, it's like,
it's a loss of freedom.
It's a loss of freedom, a loss of control. So how did you broach those conversations? And I think we talked about this, but I want to share, how many times did you have to re-broach the conversation? Like how many times did he bring it up again?
To me, at least 3 more times. If he were to walk outside and not see it in the driveway, he would ask again, "Where's my car?" You gave great advice to remind him and make him feel like he's helping to say, oh, they really needed a car. You're not using it right now. We're helping them out, to kind of deflect and make him feel like he's part of that decision.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was great advice. And he honestly hasn't brought it up again recently.
Good. So I know that you struggled with that advice because it meant that you were telling a little white lie.
Mm-hmm.
And so many families, husbands, wife, children, struggle with lying to their loved one. And we'll talk about this again in our next scenario. But how did that feel? And were you able to wrap around the thought that it was the best thing for him not to go over and over again emotionally through this scenario? Did you come to accept that? And how'd you feel about that little white lie to bring him comfort?
Yeah, I thought it was great advice. And in this case, to me, it didn't feel like so much of a white lie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it did work because he hasn't really brought it up again.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
it was hard. Just seeing him get emotional was the hardest part.
Right. And so that's really the premise behind, and I don't even really want to call it the little white lie. It's the premise behind leading them out of a scenario so they are not impacted over and over by the same emotions that they actually feel. And many times they feel it over and over. And you feel it once, it's bad enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they can't retain that. So when you keep with the story, it's over and over and over again and over and over and over again. They have the same feeling. So you're actually multiplying the emotional impact that they have. I'm glad that you felt comfortable. And I think that as a daughter, as a family member, we're not always able to see that they're not going to navigate back to that, because people say, well, what if they ask me why? Or what if they ask me in more detail? Or what if they bring it up again? Like they're going to reason through it. And they actually don't. They may repeat the questions a few times for a few days, a few weeks, but essentially it's going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
And you've really helped navigate the situation without all the emotional impact, which is really was the most heart-wrenching part to you anyway. It must be hard with your dad being a police officer to have reverse roles. And now you are essentially making decisions that you never would have made previously.
It is, yeah, especially as the youngest, but I live the closest to them.
Right.
So I'm most involved. I have one other sister that's about 45 minutes away. So she helps mostly on the weekends. And our oldest sister is in New York. So she's not here to help. So I have had to step up and be kind of that person to do most of it, or to help my mom with most of the decisions, with appointments especially.
So how are you navigating that with your sisters and the family since you're doing it? What is the weight factor in how much advice they give you or the weight that they carry in your decisions? And how are you balancing that?
It's hard.
Yeah, it is hard.
My sister and I that are down here and seeing it more day to day, week to week, I think we're more aware than my sister in New York is of just how it's progressed.
Yeah.
Yeah. My oldest sister in New York was here in November for Thanksgiving, but hasn't been here since. And a lot has happened in that time with my mom's health as well. So it's primarily my sister here, myself, and my mom that have discussions. I feel like I'm the one that does most of the research and kind of gets things done.
Yeah. Yeah. So with that and supporting care for both of your parents, and we'll get into your mom in just a minute here, have you had to make some significant changes to your own routines? You have a career, you have a life. How are you balancing life, work, care? How are you navigating that?
Yeah, thankfully, I work from home a few days a week. So we typically try to schedule any appointments during that time over lunchtime is best. So I can take him. My mom is currently not driving either. So that's been a whole other level. She was the one to take him to the appointments in the past. Now she's not. So I am juggling both of their appointments. My sister has taken off work when she needs to step in and help. She's a teacher. She's off now for the summer.
Right.
So she's kind of on duty for appointments. So that will be helpful. But It is a challenge trying to work it around my schedule. I have a really supportive manager and team. So that's been wonderful. Just my advice is to be open about what you're going through because everyone has, a personal life and family issues to take care of. And it's just going to stress you out to not be open and try to do it all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Did you receive, other than our conversations, I know we'll talk about that. Did you receive support or advice from healthcare professionals or support groups in making all these decisions or this journey? How have you done that? So you're younger, like you are really the baby, but you're also a younger person. This is kind of early. Most daughters are a little older than you that I work with. Certainly I was when I was going through it, but how have you navigated that space? Obviously you don't go to a routine support group. You're a career person. Most of the people are a little bit more advanced than your dad and older than you. So how did you navigate that space?
I probably haven't fully yet, honestly.
Okay.
It's just so hard dealing with the day to day. And sometimes it feels like to join a support group or hear what's going to happen might make me feel worse.
Yeah.
But being in a group at work where all of us are going through the same thing, my manager, two of my team members as well, being able to talk to them one-on-one has been helpful and to see what they're doing.
You actually have a work support group.
Yes.
Most of your colleagues, including me, have a family member. That is more and more prevalent. A lot of our calls and interactions revolve around having those conversations. We kind of evolved that. It's like a work support group, which I think works, and sharing stories. It's interesting. Each one of the scenarios is different. Right. But some of the, I think, validity is just having a voice to sound off what's happening, what you've tried, the options. Yeah. So I would just encourage our listening audience to maybe partner with people, especially if you're a career person. Find others around you. You'd be surprised. You can't go anywhere that you can't find someone who has a family member impacted by dementia. It's the case everywhere. Like, I can't even think of the volume at our company of people who have a family member. I don't even know what the numbers are anymore. So very good point. Well, let's shift a little bit and begin talking about another scenario. And this one was more emotional, I think, or at least it was for me when you were talking about it. There was another situation with your dad's journey recently, the loss of a beloved dog.
Yes.
And tell us about that situation. It must have been difficult. So tell us a little bit about that situation, and then we'll get into some other questions about it.
Yes. So unfortunately, just about a month ago, their 16-year-old Bichon dog named Spunky passed away. And, he's lived a good long life, but it still was just gut wrenching. My dad actually was closest to him, my mom too, but he was the primary person to take him on walks. He was just very affectionate with him. We always would say, to kind of laugh or even feel jealous that he was most attached to the dog. Everything, his life revolved around the dog in the past, even on holidays.
Yeah.
If he didn't bring the dog to our house for holidays, he would have to make sure to get home for him. He didn't like to leave him alone very long. His life really did revolve around him, and it gave him purpose.
Yeah.
So when he quickly became sick and things were going downhill, I did take him to the vet. We did some tests. We were waiting for test results. And that weekend before getting results back, he quickly declined. The dog was not eating, really moving around, so we would try to tell my dad softly, but then he would kind of panic and say, "Oh, we need to take him to the vet." And I would remind him I did take him to the vet. We're waiting for his results. So that by that Monday, the results came. He was in kidney failure. He had pancreatitis. He had a slip disc, terrible ear infection and eye infections. So unfortunately, the vet advised he would not make it and to think about putting him down. So my mom made that decision. For the next day, we were going to go together, just the two of us, not bringing my dad, of course, it'd be too emotional. But that night before, we did have that talk with him. He reacted, very emotionally at first, saying, "No, you're going to kill him. Why can't we take him to the vet and do
Mm-hmm.
something for him?" And it was it was terrible. It was the hardest part of this whole journey so far, I would say.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Luckily, the dog kind of spared us,
Mm-hmm.
and he passed away that night before having to take him in. It was going to be really emotional for my mom and I to take him.
Sure.
He did pass, so my mom had to have that conversation with him when she came
Mm-hmm.
out in the morning and realized, and he was emotional. He definitely was. But I think what became even harder than after was it felt like every hour, and I wasn't there 24/7 with him like my mom was, but
Right.
in the days after that, for a good week, he would ask where he was, or he would come into the room panicked, "Where's the dog?"
Mm-hmm.
And we'd have to tell him over again, and he would just react like he had never heard it and cry
Yes.
again.
Yes. Yeah. I remember that was
Mhm.
heart wrenching for you. I'm sure it was for your mom. Your mom was, I don't want to say getting frustrated, but she was having difficulty reliving that, retelling it,
Yeah, and
re-seeing
she was
his
grieving
reaction.
herself.
And we began to talk about that, and we began to go into making that story that would eventually go away. And it has gone away, correct?
It has. He did actually bring it up a couple of times
Mm-hmm. But
yesterday.
if you stick with the story and just reassuring, I think that it's important for us to know that he was unable to process this loss. He was unable to process the death. He was unable to process, except perhaps for a moment or 5 minutes, what had happened. Even if he would have seen it, it leaves, it's gone. And so I think the important thing that we have to remember is that we have to bring finality to situations for people who have dementia if we don't want to see the same reaction over and over. And how terrible it is, whether it's the loss of a mother or a spouse or a
Mhm.
dog or a cat, whatever the case might be, that they will relive it again. And oh, don't you remember? And I'll hear people say that. People ask me this question all the time. Oh, I just want to tell them, no, stop. I mean, it is that moment relived in their mind, even though for you, you now know it, you've processed it, you've grieved in your own little way. They're still in that moment.
Mm.
They're lost in that moment with what is around them. And we see that a lot at different scenarios through each phase or stage of Alzheimer's disease or dementia. We see that happen. And so being able to just redirect that momentarily will cause them to be able to act and react in a better manner. And it's humanitarian. The loss is there. You're not going to change it by what you say, but just that remembrance, that ability to help them walk through that can make all the difference in the world. I know that these things are hard. I think that they're different for each family, but I want to kind of begin wrapping this session
Mhm.
by asking you a very personal question. I do this because having a voice as a loved one is hugely important. And so many people don't really like to express how they're feeling or how they felt. So, first, there are two questions I want to ask before we close. What lessons, what valuable lessons have you learned through your journey so far that you would like to share? And I know that you feel new to this, although you've already come a long ways. And as you look back, what are some of the valuable lessons that you learned, either navigating something or putting something aside, or how you approach something that you would advise to other sons and daughters out there about their father?
Mhm. I would say definitely ask for help. I mentioned my sister's boyfriend, brother-in-law, they've been together a long time. Really step up and come in and help in a way that he hadn't before.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's necessary, when you're in a crisis situation, like we were, where my mom was unable to care for him, she was in the hospital. We had to reach out for support, whether it was his help or reaching out to a home health opportunities, or even on care.com has been a great site. We found someone that's able to come in and help with some of the housework
Mm-hmm.
and cleaning,
Mm-hmm.
just even a couple of days a week. Really come together and be there for each other as a family.
Mm-hmm.
Let each other get emotional and cry,
Sure.
and you'll take turns being that stronger support person, being
Mm-hmm.
the doer. There's been times where I'm so emotionally drained, and my sister will be able to step up and call the doctor and really push for appointments and things, and
Mm-hmm.
leaning on friends or coworkers that may be going through the same things,
Yeah.
and just being honest about what you're going through. You can't
Yeah.
be Wonder Woman and handle it all.
Mm-hmm. That's good advice. That's good advice. So, how do you handle the emotional toll of seeing your father's condition progress? And how has your relationship with your father changed since his diagnosis?
It's hard. I'm just naturally a very emotional
Mm-hmm.
person, but there have been times where I try to look at it as a blessing that we're getting to spend a lot more quality time together. I took him yesterday for a haircut and a shave, and actually for a manicure, pedicure. So doing these things that we never did before,
Mm-hmm.
and it's to care for him, but then it is also quality time.
Yeah.
And realizing that there may not be that much time. I don't know how
Mm-hmm.
long. He's fairly healthy besides his Alzheimer's,
Mm-hmm.
but trying to look at it as a blessing that I get to spend this time with him.
Yeah. That's a very positive spin on the situation. I certainly think that our listeners appreciate that. And we want to honor all the fathers out there as we approach Father's Day, and wanted to really talk about, in the light of dementia, the father and the father's role and how impactful it is in the family and on our lives, especially as daughters. I'm not a son. I know that's a very important position and very powerful one. If you are on the dementia journey with your father, take that time to honor them and to spend that time. You will not regret that time that you have to spend. I hope that something that we've talked about today has been impactful for you. It has been supportive for you. And we just wish you the best journey. So until next time, this is Dawn Platt. Make it a memorable day.
Thank you for joining us for the Disappearing Mind podcast. We hope it's helped you find clarity and support along your journey. Be sure to subscribe to never miss an episode, visit our website to suggest future topics, and share the podcast with friends and family.